So LSU does add a quarterback for 2025. We'll tell you about him. Locked on LSU. Let's go.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen every day. We're free, available wherever you get podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. As always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. Today's episode brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Tiger basketball squad back at it against Georgia because they have to. Another LSU staff shakeup that I want to talk about, but a shakeup on the roster for 2025 is where we'll begin, as LSU has, in fact, added a quarterback for 2025. Emile Picarella. If you're a fan of high school football in the greater Baton Rouge area, you'll know the name. Picarella has been the starting quarterback at U High for the last 2 years. That's literally on LSU's campus. And now he will head to LSU as a preferred walk-on. But this isn't the typical preferred walk-on, which is kind of what I want to talk about. So there's two parts of this conversation. One is Picarella, the player, I want to tell you about. And then two is what this means for the quarterback room moving forward. So let's dive in if we could. So let me give you a little background on Picarella first. So Emile Picarella is 6'2", 210, so good build. He's a very good high school quarterback. He played his first 2 years of high school in Mississippi. His family moved back to Baton Rouge. His parents are both LSU grads. So his family moved back to Louisiana when he was a junior, and so he transferred into U High and became the starting quarterback there for 2 years. As a junior in 2023, Picarella threw for over 2,300 yards and 34 touchdowns. So he had a very, very good junior year. Now, let's go. He did see his numbers dip as a senior a little bit, but a lot of that was, and very candidly, I was talking to Jake Hester about this, who I think everybody knows Jake Hester, number 18, played at LSU. Well, his children go to U High. His son actually was a freshman. His son Jackson, shout out, was a freshman on the LSU team this year. On the U High team this year. And so I asked him about Picarella. And he said, look, it was just kind of a weird thing. There were some games where they played in monsoons, bad fields. They were just kind of like lower scoring games. There were just some of those games like that this year. Okay, happens. But Picarella was one of those guys early in his career, like as a freshman, sophomore, who developed physically and was very mature from a football IQ perspective. And so early in his career, he stood out. At one point during a sophomore, he was a top 10 quarterback in the country for the class of 2025. And he got a lot of offers. He was offered by Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Oklahoma State, Oregon, Kentucky, Houston, Pitt, Boston College, Louisville, Akron. Those are his offers. And then he had interest throughout his recruitment from Georgia, LSU, Miami, Oklahoma, Florida State, and others. So this is a guy who was on a lot of teams' radars early in his high school career, had a very good junior year, and then a little bit, maybe kind of like everyone else, sort of started catching up to him. As I understand it, Picarella is probably a G5 type quarterback. He could have signed with Louisiana Tech, a ULL, a North Texas, a school like that, a G5 school, and gone and done very well, like a very good quarterback who's capable of playing at the FBS level, but probably at the G5 level. He is a consensus 3-star, by the way. So this isn't like one of those, it's a prospect who was a good high school player, who's going to go play JUCO or something like that. Like, he's a good he's a 3-star who had some major interest, but chose instead to walk on at his dream school instead of taking a scholarship offer from maybe a smaller school in the G5 or a lower classification. Now, I do think that part of this is challenging Because I just ran through all those offers, and what you didn't see was a ton of G5 offers. And here's a symptom, I think, of the NIL era. What you're seeing a lot is those G5 programs making a decision. Do you take the high school signee when you have limited spots, limited scholarships, or do you take a transfer? Do you take the guy that signed with a P5 who didn't really work out and ultimately decided to transfer to a lower level and play, at a lower level? That is, I think, something we're seeing far more commonly. And from the G5 perspective, they'd probably rather take a guy who has 1 or 2 or 3 years at the Power 5 level coming down to play for them instead of taking the high school prospect. So when given the choice between the two, that's what you're seeing more of. So it's kind of leaving guys like Picarella in a little bit of a hard spot. So you have the opportunity to go walk on at your dream school at a place like LSU, or go at an even lower level. Do you go play a year at JUCO just to get on the field? Do you go play Division II just to get on the field and then start working your way up once you've played and proven you could play at the next level up and you have a quarterback needy team? Maybe a really good example of this is like, look at what ULL just did. They signed Walker Howard. Walker Howard's got started at LSU, went to Ole Miss. So you're talking about a dude that's been in college for 3 years, was a highly regarded guy, now wants to get on the field and play, so he goes to ULL. If you're the Cajuns, would you rather take Walker Howard entering his 4th year or a true freshman coming up in the high school ranks in Louisiana? That's kind of what's happening. So guys like Picarella are a little bit left out in the cold in instances like that. But I think this is still a guy who has size, arm strength, physical ability, just very much a project player that isn't going to be ready to play. And quite honestly, LSU doesn't need him to play. He's walking on and is going to be a camp body, a scout team arm for all intents and purposes. Now, I said there was 2 parts of this equation. The other part, of course, is what this means for the numbers at quarterback. And that's what I think also is quite significant. Look, we all know what happened with Bryce Underwood. A little more than a month ago, Bryce Underwood, a week before signing day, flips his commitment from LSU to Michigan. At that point, it's too late for LSU to get in on any other prospects. The one they had an eye on was the quarterback who had been committed to North Carolina. He decommitted when Mac Brown was fired, but when Bill Belichick was hired, recommitted. That was the only one that LSU was sort of in on. After that, there really wasn't any other option. So when you look at Picarella, I think this is important because as you look at the quarterback numbers, remember, you've lost Ricky Collins to the portal and A.J. Swan to the portal. So coming back for 2025, all you had at that point was Garrett Nussmeier and redshirt freshman Colin Hurley. So you had the 5th-year senior and the really young guy with no experience. You had to fill that gap. And that's what they did when they went and got Michael Van Buren from Mississippi State out of the portal. Ended up starting 9 games for the Bulldogs in 2024. So you got now Nussmeier, Van Buren, a young veteran, and then you got Hurley, the younger player, the redshirt freshman. But I made this comment, and some people sort of scoffed at it at the time, but I made this comment that when they lost Bryce Underwood to Michigan, that LSU's next starting quarterback after Garrett Nussmeier was not on the roster. And a lot of people looked at that as an insult at Collins or Hurley, and that wasn't the point I was making at all. It was just circumstantial evidence that we've seen in this era of college football, suggesting guys don't stay. You had Nussmeier coming back for 2025, so Collins or Hurley very likely were going to leave. Collins left. He's now at Syracuse. That leaves Hurley. Well, you went and added Michael Van Buren out of the transfer portal, which very likely tells you Van Buren is probably the guy in 2026, barring something else unforeseen. But if that happens, then does Colin Hurley stay, or does he go look for a place to play? The point is, you see this upheaval at the quarterback position mostly because only one guy can play. And so every year you've got to add someone from the bottom. And it's not to say that those guys are going to stay for 4 years. You just have to have a quarterback room that has 4 bodies, because at this point you're a turned ankle away from having to turn to Colin Hurley or Michael Van Buren, or what else would be after that if one of those guys was lost to injury for the season. Then you're down to 2 viable options. You've got to have bodies there, if not necessarily to go win you games, but also to run scout team, to throw passes in practice, because you can't have your quarterbacks throwing so much that they get arm fatigue. It's why you bring in the NFL what they call camp bodies or camp arms. So you have to have those guys as part of your program. And that's the role Picarella is going to fill, at least early in his career. And you see if in a year or 2 years or whenever it may be, maybe he develops, is in a position to compete for a job. Maybe not. This probably ends like so many others did, leaving to go to a place where he's going to be able to see the field. But adding another body at quarterback is never a bad thing. It is never, ever, ever a bad thing to have depth at the most important position in organized team sports. And this is a guy who, again, does have good size, has a high football IQ, maybe physically isn't what you'd expect from a Power 5 quarterback, but could develop into that. So it's worth keeping an eye on. So LSU adds Emile Picarella for 2025 as a preferred walk-on. Again, so he's not counting against your scholarship, your signees for the class of 2025. He's adding as a preferred walk-on, so not counting against your 85 scholarships, but a local guy who loves the Tigers. And, it's a dream come true for him as he announces he will join LSU as a preferred walk-on in 2025. Okay, more staff shakeup within the LSU football program that I want to talk about next. Locked in LSU, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. If you're looking for tickets to the next big event, whether it's a concert, a comedy show, a sporting event, finding the right ticket at the right price, that can be a headache. But with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. So here's how it works. With Game Time Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. Use Game Time Picks like I have for a while now. There's so many reasons to love it. The curated deals, the super deal for a prime seat. You will not believe the value. And I love the seat view. It's a game changer. Before you even hit buy, you can see exactly what your seat will look like in the venue. It is very reassuring. And the best part, they've got you covered with Game Time's lowest price guarantee. So if you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund you 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to deliver on time, which with easy cancellation options if something comes up. So if you're ready to make your next event even better, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Another day brought even more of a shakeup on the LSU football support staff. There's 3 notable staff position movements to talk about. One is that J.R. Belton has been promoted to the new director of football operations. J.R. Belton is one of the truly unheralded persons within the LSU football program. He joined LSU as the director of scouting in 2021. And then in 2022, when Brian Kelly first came in, he was named the director of recruiting. He has worked hand in hand with Austin Thomas, with Frank Wilson. You've heard Brian Kelly routinely mention the work that J.R. Belton has done in helping organize and recruit and put together these classes. Well, J.R. Belton has been promoted now to LSU's new director of football operations. So what is really significant about this is Belton is now replacing Jazz Smith. So we talked about this in a previous episode. Again, if you're an everydayer, You've heard me talk about this, so thank you for that, for being an everyday. If you're not, you should be. So we talked about it last week. Jazz Smith, was a Notre Dame grad, had been with Brian Kelly at Notre Dame. In 2021, moved back home to Miami to work for the Special Olympics. When Brian Kelly got the LSU job, he brought Jazz Smith with him to Baton Rouge, hired her as the director of operations. That may sound like a fancy title, but it's a big deal. It's basically managing the day-to-day operations within the program. That is to say, when LSU goes on a road game, well, what hotel are they staying at? Well, when are they eating? How are they traveling? What time are they leaving? Transportation, bus, all that sort of stuff. When they practice, and there's the tents on the field and the cold breeze tents, like who's organized, like that is the director of football operations handling all those things operationally within the program. Okay. So that was Jazz Smith. J.R. Belton has now been promoted into that role. In addition, LSU has also had a little bit of a shakeup on the recruiting staff. So with J.R. Belton being promoted to director of operations, Donovan Tate has been promoted to director of recruiting. Tate is in his third year with the program. He was hired as a recruiting specialist in 2023 and then was promoted to associate director of player personnel in 2024 and now being promoted to the director of recruiting in 2025. So you're seeing that elevation from within. Tate played college football. He was a receiver at Nichols, graduated back in 2010, and has been with LSU for the last 3 years. They've also added, or I should say re-added, Morgan Phillips to the staff. So Morgan Phillips was at LSU, graduated from Alabama in 2023, joined LSU's recruiting staff in August of 2023, left LSU for Ohio State this past August, and now is returning as the director of recruiting events. That's according to our buddy Shay Dixon from On3. So again, J.R. Belton being promoted to director of operations, Donovan Tate being promoted to director of recruiting, and bringing Morgan Phillips back as the director of recruiting events. So you may wonder why. Like, why are we seeing all this turnover? And when you connect the dots, it's not very hard to see. This doesn't suggest that people are getting fired for not doing their job. It doesn't suggest that people are leaving because they're unhappy. It doesn't suggest any of that. What this is a very clear indicator of is what is coming with revenue share. Now, I know I've told this story before, but I had a conversation with a high-level athletic administrator 3 years ago that told me point blank, they had already begun preparing, LSU, they had already begun preparing for the inevitability of revenue share. And the projection was that it was going to happen in 2025. Well, lo and behold, here we are, and it's going to happen. But what's important to remember with revenue share is, LSU's total revenue, right around $200 million. Well, starting next fiscal year, $20.5 million of that, roughly 10% of that budget, is going to be shared with the student athletes. And LSU is going to share the full amount with its student athletes because if you want to be competitive, that's what you got to do. And of course, LSU is going to be competitive. So remember, LSU doesn't operate with a surplus. There's tremendous top-level revenue, but they spend it all. So now what you're seeing is like the only way to make up for that in a revenue share era is, one, you make more money, and or two, you cut cost. So if you got a $200 million in revenue and you spend it all, well, now 20 million of that has to go to the players. Really what you're working with is 180 for what you were using to spend 200. So somehow, some way, you either got to make more money or cut 20 million from your budget. So now cutting some football staff members ain't going to cut 20 million out the budget, but you can see what's happening. Beth Rex was the chief of staff. She left in October. They did not replace her. Austin Thomas has taken on those responsibilities. Jazz Smith will not return. J.R. Belton internally promoted. They didn't replace that spot, that position. They just promoted from within. You just saw, again, with Tate, they promoted from within. guys like Nick Brissett, Jacoby Stevens were let go. Those positions were not replaced. I don't want to suggest that what those guys were doing and those men and women were doing was insignificant, because I think many of those roles are very significant. But I think what LSU, like every other program, has had to do is take a very hard look at what is essential. And I always say actions speak louder than words. Clearly, what is essential is your on-field support staff, right? That's why we've seen LSU add Lance Guidry as an analyst to work with the Stars. Amon Anan as a special teams analyst to work with your special teams. Tim Rattay being added as an offensive analyst. Noah Joseph being added as a defensive analyst. They're adding to the on-field support staff, but they're finding ways to trim the fat, to tighten the belt a little bit in all the other areas of the support staff around LSU football, because quite honestly, they have to. Not only LSU football, but every other department within LSU athletics, because it's non-negotiable. You're going to share $20 million in revenue with your student athletes, so you got to make more and spend less. And that's a product of what you're seeing throughout all this. The question is, can those in positions that they're in continue to operate as efficiently and successfully as we've seen with the prior structure as they move forward with a leaner, scaled down staff? Time will tell, but it's decisions that LSU and everyone else right now are having to make. Okay, it is Locked on LSU, your team every day. Final break. We'll come back and we will give you a little thumbnail preview of LSU at Georgia and hoops. It's Locked on LSU, your team every day. Basketball Tigers have lost 4 in a row, and they're trying to snap that skid Wednesday night in Athens against Georgia. Not going to be easy. The Bulldogs are 15-7 overall. They're 3-6 in the league, which is not great, but LSU is 1-7 in the conference, which is second worst, only to 0-9 South Carolina. Of course, after Arkansas upset Kentucky, they're up to 2-6. Georgia at 3-6. So, we talked about it last week whenever, before LSU played Texas and they were blown out. You were heading into 6 games that were all winnable. It's not to say you were going to win them or favored to win them. It's just that they were winnable. And when you're a 1.5 point home dog and you lose by 30 to Texas, there's not a lot of reason for optimism. I remember Mike White, the former Florida coach, is now the coach at Georgia. And he's trying to get that team going a little bit here. The odds makers are not very keen on LSU. Right now, our friends at FanDuel have Georgia an 8.5 point favorite in this ball game. For a Georgia team that is 3-6 in the SEC, to be a near double-digit favorite against LSU is just nauseating. Maybe it's a little bit of recency bias. Bettors tend to focus on the last game they saw, and the last thing they saw was LSU get blown out of their home floor by Texas. Now, Georgia did lose at Alabama by 21, 90-69. So not great there either. But this game is in Athens, and Tigers have lost 4 in a row, and Georgia is 12-1 at home this year. So see if LSU can try to find a way to keep it close, and maybe scratch out a win. Georgia shoots 46% from the field, and that is a full 6 percentage points higher than LSU has allowed its opponents. So LSU's defense, which has been pretty good, against the Georgia offense, which has been better, will be something worth watching. The flip side of it is LSU, atrocious shooting the basketball, especially from 3 for the most part this season. Georgia has been even better defensively. So can LSU find a way? It's a tale as old as time with the season, with this team. Can LSU find a way to muster some offense? Cam Carter averaging 17 points per game. Jordan Sears averaging nearly 13 per game over the last 10. It's an opportunity for LSU to maybe play with a little bit of pride and see if they can scratch out a win on the road. But again, LSU is an 8.5 point road underdog at Georgia. And this is the spot in the schedule where if you were going to try to muster some pride and get a few wins, it could happen. But I would have said the same thing about Texas. Look, after you play at Georgia, you're home against a ranked Ole Miss squad. Then you're at Arkansas, which has had their struggles, but just beat Kentucky. You're at Oklahoma, which is another one of the teams in the league that's struggling, just 3-5 in conference play. Then you get to play South Carolina, who's winless in the league. But after that, the layup line ends. It's Florida, it's Tennessee, it's at Mississippi State, at Kentucky, then home against Texas A&M. I mean, that is your final 5 games against number 6, 4, 22, 14, and 10. So the wins aren't going to come down the stretch. Got to get them now. Maybe an opportunity on Wednesday on the road in Athens against Georgia. We'll see how it goes. And certainly, we'll talk about it here as we after the game goes final, as we push along here on Locked On LSU. Hey, thanks so much for making us your first listen. Now for your second listen, how about my buddy Chris Gordy over at Locked On SEC? You can find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. If you're listening on podcasts, thank you so much. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video, and let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day for Locked On LSU, your team every day.